shortly.
Okay. I'd like to begin the Planning and Zoning Commission meeting for June 16th, 2021. Welcome to tonight's meeting of the City of Tucson Planning Commission. My name is Chuck Martin, and I am the chair of the Planning Commission. The responsibilities of this body are to advise the Mayor and Council and the Planning and Development Services Department on the adoption of long-range plans, policies, specific plans, and regulations that will affect land use and development. Will staff call the roll, please?
Chair Martin?
Here.
Commissioner Gast? Absent. Commissioner Fink?
Here.
Commissioner Cassidy?
Here.
Commissioner McBride Olson?
Here.
Commissioner Pafford? Absent. Commissioner Young?
Here.
Commissioner Saylor Brown?
Here.
Commissioner Willett?
Here.
Commissioner Ortiz-Pino?
Here.
Commissioner Lucia?
Here.
And Commissioner Schwartz?
Here.
We have a quorum.
Thank you. Next item is item 2, the approval of the legal action report for May 19th, 2021. I'd entertain a motion of approval of the legal action report. Could I have a motion?
I'll move.
Second.
Thank you. All those in favor of approval, say aye.
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 Anybody opposed? I want to take item 4 out of order. There's been an issue with the legal notification, and this item needs to be continued. I'll let Daniel tell you what's going on.
Thank you, Chair Martin. So we noticed about an hour or two before the meeting that the agenda had listed it as a study session item, when in fact it's a public hearing item. It has been legally noticed with a legal ad and a mailing. So in order to meet the legal requirements, essentially, we are continuing it at this meeting, and we'll continue it till the June 30th meeting. And at that point, we'll, as long as we can get a quorum, we'll have the public hearing at that date, along with the other study session item related to accessory dwelling units. So we'll continue this, and then we have the presentation from Department of Transportation and Mobility this evening.
Do any commissioners have any questions? Or and could I get a motion to continue item 4, home-based hair salons UDC text amendment to the June 30th, 2021
So moved.
meeting?
I second.
Thank you. Next item is item number 3, presentation on Move Tucson. Daniel, could you introduce the presenter?
Yes, of course. Thank you, Chair Martin. So, so Patrick Hartley is here from the Department of Transportation and Mobility. He is the, and he can correct me if I'm wrong, the Complete Streets coordinator, and has been working on Move Tucson for the last year or so, a little longer. He is going to go over this. The reason why, just to give you a little bit of background, part of the reason why it's so important to the Planning Commission is because part of the Move Tucson kind of scope is to really set up potential changes to our major streets and routes plan. So our major streets and routes plan, which is one that is adopted and amended by the Planning Commission and has a lot of, as a significant amount of impact and input into our Unified Development Code, and a lot of the development that happens in the city was originally developed in 1982. It has been amended a few times, but it is definitely an old plan that needs to be revised. So this is going to help lead into that discussion. So with that, I'll actually just turn it over to Patrick to kind of give you an overview.
Great. Thanks, Dan. Thanks, everyone, for having me this evening to give you an update on where we are with the Move Tucson process. As Dan mentioned, it's something we've been working on since about since October 2019 now. It's been a series of delays for obvious reasons up to now, but I think we're on the home stretch. So I've got a bit of a presentation for you, and then I can open it up for questions, discussion. This takes me a moment to pull this up. All right, is that showing full screen as it should be? Great, thanks. So as I mentioned, I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of the Move Tucson process, a bit of where we started, what we've been hearing from the community, kind of the public engagement effort we've gone through, and then show you the project list that we just released publicly last week at the Mayor Council study session. And that's kind of where we are today. So for those of you who may be less familiar, what is Move Tucson? Right now, it is the in-process kind of comprehensive transportation plan for the city of Tucson. And we're looking out over basically a 20-year planning horizon to identify projects and funding priorities for how to invest our kind of finite transportation resources. It really is kind of a financially driven and a project driven plan. I mean, at the end of it, we're going to be identifying a large list of projects and kind of recommendations for systemic improvements, but it is not a financially constrained plan in the same way a Pima Association of Governments long range transportation plan is. So we're looking at kind of the whole universe of need through this effort and have gone through a prioritization process to identify projects that we can begin to line up for funding opportunities. And kind of in terms of why we're doing this now, there's a couple things on the horizon that have really presented a good opportunity for why it makes sense for us as a city to do a more comprehensive transportation plan. You know, one, and this wasn't really intended as we started, but we're starting to see a lot of activity at the federal level for increasing funding for infrastructure, for transportation in particular. And actually, we've already had an opportunity to be in discussion with our congressional delegation about earmarking specific projects that have been identified through Move Tucson. So that's already moving forward, and this planning process is really putting us in a good position to be competitive for a lot of those funding opportunities that are coming out of the, I think it's called the Invest in America Act at this point. We also wanted to be out front of the RTA Next effort to make sure that we were identifying a new set of projects that could flow into the RTA effort that were really driven by our analysis of the existing conditions in the city, what the needs are, keeping in the context of kind of the Complete Streets policy, and making sure that we had a pretty extensive public engagement process. So we know that the residents of the city would be behind the projects that we would be potentially proposing for a future RTA. And then finally, looking at potential for kind of city initiatives. So Proposition 101 will be expiring next year. Council has begun discussions, and I think they just got approval at their last study session to be looking at going to the ballot in 2022 potentially for transportation dollars. So this would be something that could help inform that effort as well. It also is really an opportunity to put together a lot of the kind of one-off modal plans we've been doing over the years. So this is our first attempt, to my knowledge, of doing a more comprehensive city-driven, city-specific transportation plan, kind of separate from regional efforts, putting together a lot of the, planning we've been doing on kind of bike boulevards and pedestrians and freight and kind of those modal elements, and putting that all together into this project list and kind of system-wide needs. So as I mentioned, we kicked off in October of 2019. We really took this public in February of 2020. We're looking to have this extensive public engagement process. We had to rethink that a little bit. Obviously, in March, the city shut down for the pandemic, and it really put a hold on a lot of our kind of in-person engagement that we're anticipating and doing. So we took a lot of time last year to really focus on the public participation component of Move Tucson, and made sure that we were letting that really drive our timeline instead of our timeline driving, kind of when we close that off. So we kind of left that open and let that take up a lot of 2020 in the Move Tucson process. So we were initially intending to be done in November of 2020, but now a more reasonable conclusion to this process is probably October of 2021 instead of November 2020. So we're going to be almost a year behind schedule. And a lot of that, I think, was driven by making sure that we're hearing from a broad cross-section of the community. And again, we wanted to really base this planning effort in what we were hearing from residents of the city. So we kicked off in October. We did a lot of that public engagement. Where we are right now is this phase 3, where we're really taking that, what we heard from the community, and turning it into recommendations, principles for the planning process, and a project list, which will then inform the implementation plan, which we are just kicking off now based on the direction we got from council at the study session last week. To show a little bit more detail of kind of how it works. So we're taking the community priorities, essentially, that we did a public survey in the spring, as well as a public input map, which I can talk a bit more about, and an existing conditions analysis of how the the transportation system is currently performing. We took all that information, translated it into a vision statement guiding principles, which then we sought to quantify and make something measurable to establish a prioritization framework to be able to prioritize a kind of this universe of projects, project list, which will then be turned into the implementation plan, sequenced, looking at kind of the early period, medium period, late period projects within that, and kind of those that would be out beyond that 20-year horizon. So I'll start with a bit of the background on the public engagement, what we tried to accomplish that, and what we heard from the community. So like this body, the Move Tucson process is being driven by a BCC of the city of Tucson called the Complete Streets Coordinating Council, which was convened as a result of the Complete Streets policy, which was passed in 2019. The 20-member body, 17 of which are voting, 17 of whom are voting, and 3 non-voting members representing ADOT, Pima County, and Pima Association of Governments. And we've been bringing Move Tucson up to them, updates to them monthly, and they've really been guiding the process and giving us the direction and kind of how to interpret what we're hearing and how we should be prioritizing. So we did a bunch of outreach, as I mentioned, through last year, including a lot of online efforts, a lot of virtual meetings, knowing that we had to come up with ways of replacing our in-person outreach that we were planning on doing would traditionally do. And we really wanted to take a kind of we come to you approach, make sure that we were getting in front of as many people as we could, and kind of get away from the hold public meetings, expect members of the community to come to us, learn about the effort, and tell us what they want. So we used a bunch of strategies to do that. We're very active on social media, engaged with the ward offices, got it out to their community members, reallocated a lot of the budget to making sure we were doing the advertisements, did Spanish, English, media, and on, virtual town hall events. One of the things we were monitoring throughout, though, was making sure that we were getting balanced participation, making sure that we were hearing equally from all residents of Tucson. And as I'm sure many of you are well aware, we have kind of historic patterns of participation because there are areas of the city, given a variety of reasons, why there are higher barriers to kind of participating in these public processes. So in June of last year, we really stopped and recollected ourselves and looked at where all of the public input was coming and did an analysis and found that a lot of what we were hearing from was from where we always hear from, because I think the pandemic and our inability to really put our resources into a lot of the in-person engagement, which we were going to focus on a lot of the low-income areas of the city, kind of reinforced the historic patterns of engagement. So we were hearing a lot from people kind of in Midtown and in this area of the city. So we looked and we were getting very low participation rates in these areas that were highlighted in red. So we really had to recollect ourselves and think, how can we get more balanced participation? So what we ended up doing is come up with a couple different strategies for doing that. One, we ended up bringing on a third-party survey firm and just doing phone calls to people. So we said we need 800 survey responses, essentially, using that same tool. And they need to live in these zip codes, and they kind of need to have this demographic profile to make sure that we are hearing from a representative sample of the city. We also worked with a program called the Street Ambassadors, which I'll get to in a second, and I'll highlight that a little bit. But at the end of that effort, what we ended up finding was that when we closed down public engagement in August, we actually had equal representation across all of the zip codes in the city based on the size of their population. So there was, kind of representational input into the Move Tucson effort, which is something we were really proud of, and I think gives us kind of a strong leg to stand on in using the public input to make an argument that this really is what the community wants in terms of the transportation system. Another piece of the output that we were doing was this web map. So a lot of what I just showed you was based on this input survey, which was asking kind of high level questions. You know, what are your priorities for transportation? Do you want better crosstown mobility, better pedestrian facilities, better pavements, better bus service, et cetera, et cetera. And then we asked people to use this public input map and to identify specific projects that would be a priority to them. And I think we ended up hearing what says it here. We got about 6,000 interactions on that map. So we got about 4,500 survey responses and then 6,000 interactions on this map. And I want to say it was about 1,500 unique project ideas or thereabouts that came in through this. So that was a really good foundation for us as we got into kind of the project identification component of the Move Tucson process. And not only was that valuable for hearing about specific projects, but we could also see a lot of themes about what were important to Tucsonans. So what were people talking about? There's a lot of things about specific neighborhood improvements they wanted to see, safer crossings. Again, a lot of comments about pavement. And then, as I mentioned, we used the street ambassadors, or worked with the street ambassadors. The street ambassadors was a new effort for us. And what this was recognizing at the outset that we were going to have more difficulty kind of in a long range transportation plan, reaching certain areas of our community. We recruited 10 volunteers with strong networks in areas of the city that were identified as kind of having higher barriers to transportation, or kind of our equity zones, we were calling them. And what they did is they kind of came up with their own proposals for how that they could reach out to their networks through social media, through door knocking. We have an example, somebody went out and did like sidewalk chalking, things like that. And they put all of their resources into those areas where we were seeing kind of lower participation rates. And, as the city, we tried not to control any of their messaging, really just said, here's what we want to get, and you guys go out there and do it in the way that makes sense to you. We'll provide the support that does it, but we wanted to make sure that they were kind of using their own voice and that they were, authentic champions of it, and encouraging people to be more trusted than, if we were writing all of those messages and kind of the way that we have to safely approach things as a department. So that was really neat, and it was really successful. And they also received a small stipend for their work. So we did have budget for 10 of them. I think it was really successful, and it would be something that we'll be looking to replicate in the future, both on individual projects and potentially on future planning efforts, but we wanted to pilot it through this process. Then the other piece of that, so that's what we heard, that was how we kind of went out to the community through last year. We also looked at the data and wanted to make sure we did that existing condition summary, because it's a community-driven process, or a lot of community-based process, but it's also we want to make sure that we have the data to support our recommendations, our project developments, and ultimately the prioritization of those projects. So what we found through our existing conditions was that it shouldn't be too surprising to anybody here, but nearly 70% of the roads are in poor condition across the city of Tucson. We've got a huge and growing safety issue on our street. 1,700 people were seriously injured or killed between 2014 and 2018. 72% of that's on our major streets. And during that period, pedestrian serious injuries and fatalities increased by 90%, up to the point where last year, I think pedestrians represented 50% of all traffic fatalities in the city. We also saw major increases in serious injuries with the restrictions due to COVID, because due to the reduced volumes on the roadway, it gave people less traffic, they could go faster. We saw higher incidence of speeding. We saw a lot more street racing. We saw accidents, and serious accidents increase a lot in the last year. 45% of the roads lack sidewalks on one or both sides. 92% of roadways have greater than a quarter-mile distance between safe pedestrian crossings. So again, if you're walking in the heat on Tucson's roads and you have to go more than a quarter-mile to find a hot crossing or a signal to get across the street, it's going to encourage you to kind of cross at unsignalized locations. But what we didn't really find is that we have a congestion issue. So as we started thinking about what is it we're trying to solve through for Move Tucson, what are those projects looking like? We see that we have a safety issue, we have a condition issue, we have an accessibility issue, but really only 9% of the roadway network is congested during peak period. And that's not really projected to grow that significantly up to 2045, which was the horizon year of this plan.
Unfucking believable.
Other than that, we also see that 70% of major roadways are high stress for bicyclists based on kind of a metric that looks at travel speeds, bike lane width, a couple of other factors. And about half of Tucsonans live within 10 minutes of transit. So kind of our takeaways from that, as I mentioned, were that what we're focusing then on Move Tucson is really increasing travel choices, improving safety, and investing in kind of the physical condition of the infrastructure that we already have. So that's really what's guiding us. We're not necessarily looking to kind of chase congestion as we have in the past. We're not using that as a real driver of identifying these projects. We recognize that there are going to be trade-offs where we have pinch points and you know, kind of short periods of congestion potentially on our network, but kind of what are the costs of those relative to what it is that we're trying to solve for in this planning effort, and kind of letting the community tell us and letting the data drive those decisions. We turned all that information then into these draft guiding principles, which we then kind of quantified and used for the prioritization. So these are authentic, kind of keeping true to the way Tucson is, building on the assets that we have, connected, and that is looking to close gaps in the network, making sure that we're providing for all travelers, all modes, kind of closing the sidewalks gaps, making sure we have those low stress bike facilities, making sure that we have interconnected network that does support crosstown travel, an optimized system that is looking at where we have excess capacity or capacity kind of pinch points, capacity constraints that we want to address, and kind of right sizing our network, right sizing our roadways, safe, should be obvious, equitable. This was one of a major driver of this planning process, and it was something new that we looked at. So we looked at these equity areas in the city of Tucson, and that is where you have a higher concentrations of populations or households in poverty without access to an automobile, seniors, persons with disability, people under 18, and use that actually to create a multiplier through our prioritization to kind of make sure that those areas were given extra weight, knowing that the needs in those parts of the city would be higher, and those populations, people within those areas, have a tendency to be kind of more dependent on public transportation, on sidewalks, on bike lanes. So really addressing those deficiencies and addressing kind of that historic disinvestment by looking proactively at equity and getting away from kind of that framework of, you know, equal across the city, and making a deliberate choice to invest more where those needs are. And then resilient, and this was looking at opportunities for kind of supporting shorter trips, mode shift, kind of green infrastructure investments in the face of climate change. So then we turn this into our project prioritization effort, which was a 5-step process, which was really the meat of the effort, I think, because we ultimately had identified about 233 projects that we have to turn into something that we want to put into future funding plans. So our 5-step process was to identify projects, to measure the network, to develop a calibration tool, to score the projects, and to create an implementation plan. And I'll step through these. So the first thing we did is kind of parallel to developing a prioritization framework, is we had to identify the specific projects that we'd be looking at. And we, to some extent, started with a blank slate on this. We did look at a lot of the existing plans, and we incorporated our existing projects that were in the RMAP, or the Regional Transportation Plan. We brought in the Bike Boulevard Master Plan. We brought in the Greenways Plan, and a couple others, the ADA Transition Plan. But then we were taking a lot of that public input that we received through the public input map, as well as the existing conditions analysis, to really identify what people want, where they wanted it, and where those deficiencies existed, and let a lot of that drive this project list. We ended up coming up with about 234 projects totaling roughly $5 billion just in the capital projects. And at our current expenditure rate at the city, that would probably take us 40 to 50 years to build all of that, which is why we wanted to go through this prioritization effort. One other plan I should mention as well is the long-range regional transit plan. So we pulled in some of the high-capacity transit corridors that had been previously identified through that. We didn't really identify new streetcar or bus rapid transit corridors for this plan, separate from those that had already gone through a more extensive analysis through the LRTP. So now that we've got our 233 projects, what do we do with them? The next step is to take those guiding principles and turn them into a way of kind of measuring and applying them to the network. So when we looked at connected, the measure that we wanted to develop was how many modal networks can be improved or further supported through these investments. You know, is there a deficiency for bicyclists, for pedestrians? Is there a pinch point for vehicles? And then the scores reflect the opportunities to improve the deficiencies. Also, is this on a proposed frequent transit network route? So is this on a corridor where we would be anticipating having a future of 15-minute or better transit service? If that's the case, that's something then that we want to invest in making sure that we have the bicycle and pedestrian connections to that and the safe crossings for transit riders. Optimized, and we looked at this in two ways, and this was new for us. So we looked at both where we have projected congestion, so taking the Pima Association of Governments transportation model, looking at 2045 and looking at base year and seeing where the level of service falls below D, or the VOC, volume capacity ratio, goes above 0.8. We also flipped that on its head and looked at where we have excess capacity. So where is it that we have overbuilt our roads historically, and we have no expectation that we are going to meet those volumes? We saw those as opportunities where we could potentially reallocate space on the roadway to other uses, knowing that, again, what we're trying to solve for is not necessarily congestion, but we're trying to improve transportation choices, improve safety. Those are real opportunity areas where, those volumes never came to fruition. We overbuilt those roads, but now we have it in the right of way and we can reallocate that space. Safe, we kind of double weighted this. And again, we looked at the frequency of crashes as well as the frequency of severe crashes, knowing that sometimes it's just a matter of luck that turns a non-injury crash into something that becomes more severe. So we wanted to look at both of those factors. Resilient, can it support better local trip, shorter, more local trips? And then equitable, I talked about, kind of areas of the network that were within those high equity zones where people have higher barriers to transportation. We then segmented the network out and looked at it cross street to cross street, locals and majors, and this is what that looks like. So the red are kind of the lower priority. A lot of those are falling on your local streets, and then that darker hue is the kind of the higher priority. If you see this gray kind of transparency over the map, these are what were deemed kind of those equity areas. Again, these are those areas that you got that 2 times multiplier, and a lot of the projects that were falling into the higher tier then are going to be driven into these areas because of that multiplier. So the way this worked is we started and just did that whole surface of the street network, and then what we did is overlaid the project extents on that. So you can see that each segment of the street would receive a unique score based on the performance of that underlying segment, and then overlaid the project and averaged it to the length of the project to come up with that project score for the base score of the project. So here's a real example of that looks like, what that looks like. So we had a project on Speedway for a modernization project, which is our kind of what we're calling our catalyst corridor, which is making improvements without adding lane capacity, essentially, because we've got underlying safety issues. So you can see over here that these are higher priority, and then these are lower priority along the extent, broken at each of those segments. So each of those segments has a unique value based on that network screening, which is then smoothed to the extent of the project length, and the project is given a final score within our prioritization scheme. So that's kind of how we measured the network. So then we came up with a base score for all 230 projects within our project list. And then we developed a calibration tool, which was applied after the network screening, and basically a way to kind of move those borderline projects up and down. So the network screening was a maximum score of 100 points. Project calibration was a max of 20 points. So it's not as heavily weighted, but this is really looking at opportunities to kind of move those borderline projects based on opportunities. So we looked at whether or not it had identified as ward or public support. If there were opportunities for human-centered design, and human-centered design in this case was, we looked at commercial corridors with lower traffic volumes as opportunities that those could be kind of main streets within the city of Tucson, or destination commercial streets, knowing that the zoning is in place, the traffic volumes are low, so those could be areas where people would want to walk and bike potentially. We also gave extra points for bike boulevards and greenways. Whether it closed network gaps in terms of like two low stress bikeways coming together, for example. Whether there was poor pavement quality and the project offered an opportunity to improve the underlying pavement. We looked at the cost effectiveness, basically looking at the overall kind of cost per benefit per mile, and compared the projects that way. And then opportunities for heat mitigation, identified whether the project is located in a high heat severity area. Our assumption is that a good number of these projects would include additional canopy, landscaping, green infrastructure features that could help address the heat island effect, the heat mitigation. And then ultimately we screened all of those projects and put them into 3 tiers, tier 1, 2, and 3, based on their underlying project score. Now, we're using the tier just a way as kind of making this a little more consumable, breaking them into different levels. But we're not necessarily committing to only building tier 1 projects at this point. All things being equal, I think we would be more heavily weighted to tier 1 projects, because those would be the projects that are scoring better, that we deemed through that review, through public input, of kind of meeting more of the needs, better achieving the goals of Move Tucson. That said, if opportunities arise to have partnerships, cost sharing, what have you, or just if there are other projects that are moving forward that make sense for us to elevate a tier 2 or a tier 3 project off of this list, then we would certainly be in a position to do so. And I can break them down a little bit more than kind of that map of the 230 projects. So we've categorized these into 4 project types. We're calling Catalyst Corridor, Strategic Solutions, Local Connections, and High Capacity Transit. The reason we did this is because we wanted to get away from our traditional thinking of talking about projects in terms of the modes that they serve. A lot of the projects that we're presenting are kind of multimodal improvements. Again, we're getting away from kind of that history of just only adding sidewalks and bike lanes when we do a lane widening, and see if there are opportunities for kind of building in these complete streets projects, these modernization projects. So really the way we've categorized these is kind of by scale and scope. So catalyst corridors are your big capital projects, your big expensive ones. We're going down to the roadbed, we're moving curbs, we're touching everything, and those are going to have a bigger price tag on them. So I guess the best way I can think of this is, imagine like the Broadway corridor project without necessarily adding an additional travel lane. Like, we're going to change everything out there and redo it. Strategic solutions would be where there might just be a single deficiency or 1 or 2 deficiency on the corridor. So these could be more strategic, smaller scale projects where we can go in and just build out a sidewalk, maybe add an additional crossing, maybe upgrade the bike lane when we do repaving, things like that. Local connections are largely greenways and bike boulevards projects. These are your projects that aren't on your major street network, but are really happening on local streets. And then high capacity transit projects. These would be the new streetcar, bus rapid transit corridors that we'd be looking at. So these are the big ticket catalyst corridor projects that I mentioned. So there's fewer of them, but these would be the ones where we could potentially be looking at kind of doing an overhaul of the whole corridor, changing what that looks like, how it operates, who it's serving, but not necessarily expanding. Where we're really focusing on expansion, and I won't say that there aren't any, but it is very few. Most of the expansion projects where we're adding travel lane capacity is in the southeast quadrant of the city. And a lot of these are widening projects or new facilities to serve growth in the Houghton area master plan area. We'd be looking at a Harrison Road Greenway extension, kind of where the Greenway is right now, widening and modernizing this section of Irvington, potentially widening this section of Kolb. And so the catalyst corridors are those big multimodal projects. And our assumption is that these are going to include new traffic signals, new pavement, potentially moving curb, enhanced bike lanes, green infrastructure feature, optimized traffic signals, kind of everything that you would expect in one of these projects, medians or access control, frequent safe crossings, additional hawk lights, things like that. So we're hanging all that on these projects. And here's an example of one we're looking at on the Drexel Road. So you can see, you know, it's just kind of strip paved. There's no curb. There's not a lot of lighting here, not a lot of traffic control. So the catalyst project here would be putting in curbs, putting in sidewalks, lighting. This project also includes a new bridge over the Santa Cruz, shade vegetation and enhanced bikeway, either a protected or buffered bike lane. That's what we're saying when we're saying enhanced bikeways, and then reconstruction of the pavement. And then the strategic solutions, as I mentioned, these are those smaller scale projects. We might be doing one or two things on them. So for example, what we're looking at, like Houghton and Valencia and Kolb primarily, would be upgrading to adaptive signal control, you know, integrating smart traffic signals, because we recognize there's still demand, you know, for crosstown mobility. We've identified several corridors, 9 corridors in this plan for focusing on signal upgrades. And that would be really kind of integrating the smart signals more or less to make, you know, to optimize what we have at a much lower price point, a much lower cost. And then a lot of these would be kind of 1 or 2 improvements. So here's an example, for example, on North 6th Street, or North 6th Ave rather. What we'd be looking here would be, you know, adding some lighting, doing some pavement, potentially as we repave, building in buffered or protected bike lanes and filling our sidewalk gaps. But we're not talking about moving curb and tearing this thing up and, you know, totally reallocating this space. And then we looked at the greenways and the bike boulevards, as I mentioned. These are off of your major streets. These went through that same prioritization and really implementing the Greenway Master Plan and the Bike Boulevard Master Plan. I always forget the name of the Greenway Plan, so forgive me on that. It's the Pima County Plan for the greenways. And then the high capacity transit corridors, so we'd be looking at bus rapid transit and or streetcar on a lot of these. We were successful in the federal earmarking process to get out of committee in the House to secure some funding for additional work on this north-south spine of this, which would largely be bus rapid transit between the airport and the Tohono Tadai Center. We also were successful in securing a federal grant looking at transit-oriented development along this same corridor. So we would be prioritizing probably that north-south spine, but also looking at potential opportunities on Broadway and Speedway. There's some discussion, exploration of rapid service on Broadway at the moment, for example. So that was the $5 billion project list. There is a, you know, project by project description that was available, went out to council, it's now available publicly. We're looking to get it on the Move Tucson website. It's not quite there yet, but we will be sharing that back out publicly soon. In addition to the capital projects and the name projects, we recognize we have a number of more systemic needs in how we invest in our transportation system. So the capital projects, as I mentioned, the list we just went through is totaling about $5 billion. We've also identified about $930 million in sidewalk ADA needs in the city of Tucson. Now, some of these would be addressed through that project list you just looked at. So this isn't independent of that, but this would also be a need for local streets, which aren't being addressed that much through those projects. Also, just some of the smaller spot improvements, you know, where we might just need to do a single curb ramp or something like that. That's what we'd be looking at with that $930 million. If we wanted to upgrade the entire traffic signal network, we'd be looking in the ballpark of about $55 million for communications, detections, new controllers. We've identified some projects for street lighting improvements in the vicinity of $10 million. Looking at our need right now for pavement repair and preservation, it's about $1.1 billion, and that includes majors and locals. And a lot of that would be kind of one time, but there would be some funding for preservation as well. And then looking at things that we would want to be investing in kind of continuously over that 20-year planning horizon. If we were to implement the frequency and kind of network rerouting recommended through the long-range regional transit plan, we're looking at another $1.1 billion, which would be almost doubling kind of, or a 50% increase in our current transit expenses. 60 million for safety, and then a couple of additional programs. So that's kind of the whole picture. And as we put together the implementation plan, what we'll be doing is looking to balance kind of these systemic needs with those individual projects. And as we go forward, you know, thinking about what we want to fund as a department or as a city into the future through RTA or through a city-specific initiative, kind of what is that slice that makes sense to support SunTran, to be investing in our pavement or to be investing in these more comprehensive capital projects. So where we are right now is that on July 1, we'll be going back to the public with this project list. It is available publicly now, but we haven't really put any energy behind, you know, taking comments from the community on how we've interpreted all of that and turned it into a project list. So starting July 1, we'll be going out publicly and giving the community an opportunity to review all that project list, see what's happening, you know, what's proposed near their neighborhood, allow folks to make comments on each individual project. We'll have like a like-dislike feature on it so people can tell us which projects they like, which ones they don't. And there'll also be a financial component of that. So we'll be putting together that systemic piece with the capital piece and asking people, you know, if you had $100 to distribute to transportation improvements in the city of Tucson, how would you distribute those funds? Would you put it all on pavement? Would you put more of it on bicycle and pedestrian? Would you put it on traffic signals? So asking people to kind of give us their thoughts on those decisions. August, we're looking to finalize that project list, take the input we were here through this final round of public engagement and put together the draft implementation plan, thinking about how, you know, we would recommend using city resources. Bring that draft implementation plan to mayor and council in September for review, comment, any edits, revisions, and then finalizing Move Tucson in October. And as we finalize Move Tucson, we'll also be taking out pieces of that and thinking, you know, what is the subset of this that makes sense to kind of submit to the RTA for inclusion in the RTA Next effort? Is there any piece of this that would make sense to fit into kind of the city initiative? And that's what I have for you. So if you're interested in any of this, all of the information, the more, you know, comprehensive overview of the public input of the existing conditions report is all available right now on movetucson.org. You can take a look for yourselves and kind of see what we've been through. But with that, I can take any questions.
Thank you, Patrick. Do any of the commissioners have any questions for Patrick? I don't see any hands raised or anybody asking questions. Oh, Thomas, did you? Oh, he's waving goodbye, I guess.
I was just itching.
Okay. Thank you for the presentation and look forward to hearing more about this.
Yeah, and I can send Dan, just let it know when we go live. If everybody wants to see and have an opportunity to comment on the projects, we can share back with the group and that's available.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome to stick around if you want, but nothing too exciting happening now. Next item is item number 5, PDSD staff announcements. Do you have any announcements?
I don't think we have too many announcements, but I do want to just kind of follow up Patrick's presentation. And thank you so much, Patrick, for sharing that really great overview of Move Tucson. I just want to highlight that we really see Move Tucson as creating a framework and a foundation for a lot of future land use planning in the city. And this is going to help kind of focus a lot of our goals around transit-oriented development, on new growth areas for the city and things like that. And we're really trying to enhance our collaboration between land use planning and transportation planning between our departments and really work collaboratively and holistically as we plan for the city. So again, thank you, Patrick, for sharing this with the Planning Commission. And we also see Move Tucson as creating a foundation for Plan Tucson, the next update to the general plan, which we will be working on over the next few years. And we will be updating Planning Commission on that in the next few months and really over the next 9 to 12 months as plans for the launch of our general plan update really kind of get underway. So more to come on that. But again, we really see Move Tucson and some of the other major citywide planning efforts that are underway right now as creating a foundation for our next general plan. And of course, the general plan will, we will have a lot of touch points with Planning Commission. You all will have a lot of updates and have a really big role in the update of our general plan as that comes to Planning Commission for review and recommendation to Mayor and Council.
Thank you.
There's one other planning effort I want to put on your radar, which is we are working on a new neighborhood plan, the Menlo Park neighborhood plan. And this is actually the first new neighborhood plan that we have developed in over a decade as a city. So that was initiated by Mayor and Council about 1.5 years ago. We've kind of been, had a lot of pre-planning to this one, kind of similar to Move Tucson. Just had to pause our outreach efforts in the last year, but we are going to kind of launch that planning efforts publicly next week at the Dia de San Juan Festival. And we would actually like to provide a kind of brief update to Planning Commission on the neighborhood plan process sometime in the next few months when we can get it on the schedule. Because we want to kind of give you an early look at some of the goals for that plan and just what the process will look like, because again, the neighborhood plans all come to Planning Commission for review, public hearing and recommendation before it goes to Mayor and Council.
Thank you. I had a question about in-person meetings. Has there been any discussion about in-person meetings for the commission?
Yes, that is something we're discussing. And we actually, I think Dan might have shared a survey with some of you. We just put a survey online that we're surveying all of our board and commission members, as well as a lot of our kind of frequent applicants and members of the public about their preferences for in-person versus virtual meetings. Of course, we're hoping it's not one or the other, but we're looking for kind of some hybrid options or maybe options where, you know, one might be the default mode, but we occasionally have in-person or vice versa meetings. What we're really waiting for though is guidance from the state attorney general. And then of course from our city attorney and city clerk. And Puri's on the line, she might be able to share a little bit more, but the state attorney general did relax certain open meeting law regulations as a result of the pandemic. And that's how we were able to move to 100% virtual meetings. However, even if, you know, there is a legal requirement to meet open meeting law to have in-person meetings, we're hoping that we can still bring in a lot more virtual options for the public to attend. Because what we found is we're hearing from a lot of community members that it's easier for them to attend virtual meetings to be able to testify and speak on items, and it's very convenient for many members of the public. But we know for some people attending in person is easier, so we ultimately want to be able to provide multiple options.
Thank you. Are there any questions from the commissioners?
I don't know if Piri had more on the open
sorry.
meeting law aspects. That's okay.
Hi, this is Piri. I don't have much to add to what you said, Corin. We're still operating under also the emergency declaration that was initiated by the mayor when COVID started. So, and in that part of that declaration is that all meetings be held online. So it's going to very much be a decision that will be made with the mayor's office and in conjunction with the clerk and with the city attorney advising, because it will have to apply to boards across the city.
Thank you. Any commissioners have any questions? Thank you. The next item is item 6, future agenda items.
Yeah, so future agenda items, we have obviously the public hearing that we continued from today for the home-based hair salon. So we'll have that on June 30th, along with the study session for the accessory dwelling units will be coming to you on that date as well.
Thank you. Next item is call the audience. And at this time, anybody in the audience to speak about an item that's not on tonight's agenda, which we didn't have much, so. Not seeing any hands raised, or we'll move on to item number 8, adjournment. Chair would entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second,
A second.
thank you. All those in favor say aye.
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 Any nays? Hearing none, the meeting is adjourned. Thank you, everybody, for attending. Sorry about the glitch. I know everybody wanted to get the hair salon text amendment passed as fast as we could. So thank you. Looks like next meeting will be June 30th. So have a good evening.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.